Good evening. I'm glad you're here. I was organizing my grandfather's old letters tonight, the ones he kept in a shoebox in the basement, and I noticed something. The box smells like old paper and basement, and maybe a little bit like the cherry pipe tobacco you used to smoke on the porch. It's a specific smell. You probably have a smell like that in your life, something that takes you right back to a person or a time. That's what happened to me just now, and that's why I thought I'd talk to you about the Second World War for a little while. I know that might sound like an unusual topic for this time of night, and maybe it is, but I've found that history, when you approach it the right way, slowly and with attention to the small details, can actually be quite calming. It's already happened, you see. There's a comfort in that. All those moments of uncertainty have been resolved. The questions have been answered, even if the answers are sometimes sad. So if you'd like, you can get comfortable. Maybe adjust your pillow. Make sure you're warm enough. And I'll just talk for a while about the Second World War, but not in the way you might expect. Not all the big battles and strategy maps, though we'll touch on some of that. Mostly I want to talk about the small things, the quiet things, the things that help me understand what it might have been like. And hopefully, somewhere in here, you'll drift off to sleep, and that'll be just fine. My grandmother had a garden. You probably knew that was coming. Most grandmothers in this part of Michigan had gardens. Still do, I suppose, though my nana passed in 2003. Her garden was in the backyard, and it was very organized. She had rows of tomatoes, green beans, carrots, lettuce, and these enormous zucchini that she never quite knew what to do with. None of us did. We'd have zucchini bread, zucchini pasta, grilled zucchini. One time she made a zucchini pie, which was interesting. She called it her victory garden, even though the war had been over for more than 50 years. I asked her about that once when I was maybe 10 or 11. I said, "Nana, why do you still call it a victory garden? Didn't those end after World War II?" And she looked at me with this gentle smile. She had a very gentle smile. And she said, "Well, Joey, I suppose it did. But I like to remember that growing your own food is always a kind of victory. Over laziness, over waste, over forgetting how. I think about that sometimes. How the war changed the way a whole generation thought about ordinary things. Food, metal, rubber, light even. They had to cover their windows at night, blackout curtains, so that enemy planes wouldn't see the lights of cities and know where to drop their bombs. Imagine having to hide light itself. My grandmother was 15 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. She was living in a small town in Ohio, even smaller than Marquette, if you can imagine that. And she told me that when the news came through on the radio, her father turned off all the other lights in the house, and they sat there in the kitchen just listening. Not saying much, just listening to the radio announcer's voice coming through the static, trying to understand what it meant. She said it felt like the whole world had gotten suddenly smaller and bigger at the same time. Hold on a moment. Do you hear that? That's snow falling. We got about 4 inches today, and it's still coming down out there, very light, just drifting past the window. I've always loved the sound of snow falling at night, even though technically snow doesn't really make a sound when it falls. What you're hearing is the absence of other sounds. The snow muffles everything. The wind, the cars that aren't driving by, even the hum of the refrigerator seems quieter somehow. It creates this pocket of silence. I wonder if soldiers thought about snow. Probably they did, especially the ones in Europe during the winter of 1944. That was a terrible winter. The Battle of the Bulge happened in December in the Ardennes forest, and it was so cold that the soldiers' rifles would freeze. They had to sleep in foxholes in the snow. Some of them didn't have proper winter gear because the army hadn't expected the fighting to last through winter there. There's a photograph I saw once in a book. I think it was at the library, in the history section on the second floor, past the large print mysteries, and it showed an American soldier sitting in a foxhole, and everything was white. Just white. Snow and fog, and this one dark figure sitting there, wrapped in whatever he could find. And I remember thinking, this person was someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone's father. And right now, in this photograph, he's colder than he's ever been in his life. And he's more scared than he's ever been. And he's so far from home. But here's the thing. He probably also thought the snow was beautiful. I believe that. I think even in the worst moments, people notice beauty. They can't help it. It's part of being human. Let me tell you some facts about World War II, but slowly, so they don't startle you. The war lasted 6 years. It started on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. It ended on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. That's 6 years and 1 day, if you're counting, which means that someone who was 18 when the war started was 24 when it ended. Those are important years. Those are the years when you're figuring out who you are. Over 70 million people died. That's a number so large it becomes almost meaningless, doesn't it? You can't picture 70 million people. I can barely picture 70 people all in one place. Maybe at a wedding or a school assembly. 70 million is everyone in Michigan, 3 times over. It's every person you've ever seen in your entire life. And then thousands and thousands more you haven't. So instead, let's think about one person. There was a man from Marquette named Frank Holden. He graduated from high school in 1941, same school where I teach. He worked at the iron ore mine for about a year, and then he enlisted in the army after Pearl Harbor. He was 20 years old. I found out about Frank because his name is on a plaque in the school's main hallway, along with 15 other names, former students who died in the war. I walk past that plaque almost every day during the school year, and for a long time, I'm embarrassed to say, I didn't really see it. It was just part of the wall, part of the building. But then one day, this was maybe 3 years ago, I stopped and really looked at it. I read every name, and I wondered, who were these people? So I went to the library and asked Deb at the reference desk if there were any records, and she helped me find some old yearbooks and newspaper clippings. That's how I learned about Frank. In his yearbook photo, he's wearing a suit that looks slightly too big for him, and he has this hopeful smile. Under his picture, it says his hobbies are fishing and radio repair. There's a quote next to his name, "Don't worry about the future, it'll come soon enough." That's not a quote from anyone famous, I don't think. I think that's just Frank's personal motto. Don't worry about the future. Frank was killed on June 12, 1944, in Normandy, 6 days after D-Day. He was part of the 29th Infantry Division. I don't know exactly how he died. The records just say KIA, killed in action. He's buried in the Normandy American Cemetery in France. I've never been to France, but I've seen pictures of the cemetery. It's beautiful. Rows and rows of white crosses and stars of David, perfectly straight, on a green lawn overlooking Omaha Beach. More than 9,300 graves. Frank is in Section E, Row 12, Grave 43. His mother kept his room exactly the way it was for the rest of her life. I know this because there was a small article about her in the Mining Journal in 1959, on Memorial Day. The reporter asked her why, and she said, "It helps me remember he was real." That breaks my heart a little bit, if I'm honest. But it also makes sense to me. Here's something I think about sometimes when I can't sleep. If you were 18 in 1940, and you were American, you had about a 1 in 12 chance of serving in the military during the war. Those aren't bad odds, I suppose. 1 in 12. But if you did serve, and you were in a combat role, your chances of being killed or wounded were much higher. Some units had casualty rates of over 50%. 50%. Imagine flipping a coin to see if you'd come home, and it wasn't just soldiers. The war touched everyone. Everyone. If you were a woman, you might have gone to work in a factory, building bombers or jeeps or ammunition. There's a famous poster of Rosie the Riveter. You've probably seen it. We can do it. With the woman flexing her arm in the blue work shirt and red bandana. Women built almost everything we used in that war. They welded, they wired, they riveted. My grandmother worked in a parachute factory for 2 years. She said the silk was beautiful, even though she knew what it was for. If you were a child, you collected scrap metal. You saved bacon grease and brought it to collection centers because they used it to make glycerin for explosives. You had ration books for sugar, coffee, butter, meat, shoes, gasoline. You learned to do without. If you were old, or if you couldn't serve for some reason, you bought war bonds. You knitted socks for soldiers. You wrote letters to boys overseas that you didn't even know. Dear soldier, they'd start. I hope this letter finds you well and safe. And if you were Japanese American, living on the West Coast, you were put in a camp. That's something we don't talk about enough, I think. More than 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, forced to leave their homes and businesses and live behind barbed wire in the desert because the government was afraid. It was wrong. President Reagan apologized for it in 1988, and the government paid reparations. But you can't give people back years of their lives. You can't unbuild that fence. I want you to imagine a sound for a moment. The sound of a telegram being delivered. Not the radio and TV telegrams we think of now, those singing messenger services. A real telegram. During the war, telegrams were how the military notified families about casualties. A Western Union messenger, often a teenager, would ride his bicycle to your house and knock on the door and hand you a yellow envelope. If you saw that messenger coming up your street, your heart would stop. Everyone knew what it might mean. The telegram was very short, official. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son or your husband, and then the name, and then was killed in action, or is missing in action, or has been seriously wounded. My grandfather told me that during the war, in his neighborhood in Milwaukee, whenever the telegram boy appeared at the end of the block, people would watch from their windows to see which house he went to. And when he knocked on a door, and the door opened, you could hear the sound carry down the street sometimes. Not the words. The telegram was silent, but the sound that came after. Crying, or worse, silence. He said that was the sound of the war at home. That moment when the telegram arrived. Over 400,000 telegrams like that were sent to American families. 400,000 families who answered the door and received the worst news possible. And then, somehow, those families had to keep living. They had to keep going to work, making dinner, sleeping, waking up. They had to survive their own grief, which is a kind of battle too. I looked up what the weather was like on D-Day, June 6th, 1944. I got curious about it one night. This was last summer, actually, during a thunderstorm. I was lying in bed, listening to the rain, and I thought, I wonder what the weather was like when those soldiers were landing on the beaches. So I got up and looked it up on my laptop. It was terrible. The weather was terrible. That's actually why they almost postponed the invasion. General Eisenhower, who was in charge, had to make a decision. Go on June 6th, despite the storms, or wait for better weather and risk the Germans discovering the plan. He decided to go. The English Channel was rough, waves 6 feet high. It was cold, cloudy, windy. Not the kind of day you'd want to go to the beach, let alone storm a fortified coastline while people are shooting at you. A lot of the soldiers got seasick on the transport ships before they even reached the shore. They were throwing up, miserable, scared. Some of them had never seen the ocean before. Boys from Kansas, from Iowa, from little towns in the Midwest, where the biggest body of water was a lake or a river. And now here they are, in the dark, in the cold, crossing the English Channel in a storm, knowing that in a few hours they're going to run up a beach while machine guns fire at them. When the landing craft ramps dropped and the soldiers ran out into the water, a lot of them drowned immediately. The water was deeper than expected, over their heads, and their packs were so heavy, 60, 70 pounds of equipment, that they just went under. Some of them never even made it to the sand. I can't imagine how cold that water was, but here's something else I learned. Later that day, after the beach was secured, the weather started to clear. By evening, there were moments of sun breaking through the clouds. And some of the soldiers, the ones who had made it, who were still alive, they sat on the sand and they felt the sun on their faces. And maybe, I hope, maybe for just a moment, they felt warm. My grandmother had a recipe box. It was a little wooden box with a floral pattern, and it was full of index cards with recipes written in her careful handwriting. Some of them were recipes she'd gotten from her mother, and some were from magazines, and some were just things she'd figured out herself over the years. One of the cards, I have it now actually, it's in my kitchen, is labeled Depression Cake, but she'd crossed that out and written War Cake above it. It's a chocolate cake, sort of, but it has no eggs, no milk, and no butter, because those were rationed during the war. Instead, it has water, vegetable shortening, vinegar, and cocoa powder. I made it once, just to see what it was like. It was fine. Not great, but fine. A little dense, a little dry, but you know what? It tasted like chocolate cake. If you were a kid in 1943, and you hadn't had cake in a while, it probably tasted wonderful. That's ingenuity. That's making something out of nothing because you have to. Because life goes on even during a war. Birthdays still happen. You still want something sweet sometimes. The recipe says at the bottom, in parentheses, Tommy's favorite. Tommy was my grandmother's younger brother. He was 12 during the war. I never met him. He died in a car accident in 1967, but I like knowing that this strange little cake was his favorite. I like knowing that this one small detail survived. A lot of families kept maps on their walls during the war. Maps of Europe, maps of the Pacific. They'd put pins in them to mark where their son or husband or brother was stationed, if they knew, or where the fighting was happening, based on what they heard on the radio or read in the newspapers. My grandfather's mother had a map of Europe on the kitchen wall. My grandfather was in England for most of the war. He was in the 8th Air Force, not a pilot, but ground crew, working on B-17 bombers. Every week she'd move the pin based on his letters, which took 2 or 3 weeks to arrive. So she was always a little bit behind, always wondering, where is he now? Is he safe? Is he still alive? She never moved the pin to Germany, even though that's where the bombers went. She only marked where she knew he was stationed, as if keeping the pin in England would keep him safe. It worked, I suppose. He made it home. But not everyone did. I imagine thousands of kitchens across America, all with maps on the walls, all with pins, all with mothers and wives standing there with a cup of coffee, looking at the map and trying to understand what was happening so far away, trying to feel close to someone they couldn't see or touch or hear. Soldiers carried things with them, not just the equipment, the rifle, the helmet, the rations, but personal things, small things, letters from home, folded and refolded so many times the creases wore through, photographs, usually of girlfriends or mothers or family, kept in the helmet or tucked into a shirt pocket close to the heart, Bibles, rosaries, lucky coins, a harmonica, a watch that had belonged to a father. My grandfather carried a small New Testament that his mother had given him when he shipped out. It fit in his pocket. On the first page, she'd written, "Come home safe. We love you, Mom." That's all. Just that. He kept it with him for the entire war, and then he kept it on his bedside table for the rest of his life. I have it now. It's very small, very worn. The pages are soft, like cloth. You can tell it's been held a lot. I don't know if he read it much. He wasn't a particularly religious man, at least not in any way he talked about. But I think it wasn't really about the words in the book. It was about carrying something from home, something that connected him to the people he loved, to the life he had before the war, and the life he hoped to return to. That's what those objects were. They were proof that another world existed. A world with mothers and birthdays and kitchens and normal Tuesdays. A world worth fighting for, worth surviving for. Here is something I didn't know until recently. In England during the war, people could hear the bombers taking off at night. The American air bases were in the countryside, but the sound carried. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, all starting their engines at the same time, warming up, taxiing to the runway. The whole sky would vibrate with the sound. English families would lie in bed and listen to them going overhead, wave after wave, heading toward Germany. It would go on for hours sometimes. Thousands of young men in those planes, sitting in the cold. It was so cold at high altitude, 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Flying into the dark, knowing that some of them wouldn't come back. The people on the ground would count the planes going out, and then in the morning they'd count them coming back. And the numbers never matched. A woman I read about in a memoir, her name was Constance, and she lived near an airbase in Suffolk. She said she would pray for every plane she heard. Just a quick prayer, not even words really, just a thought sent up with each engine's roar. Come home, she'd think, come home safe. She didn't know any of the men in the planes. They were strangers, foreigners, Americans, but she prayed for them anyway because that's what you do. That's what people do. Coffee was rationed during the war. Did you know that? £1 per person, per month if you were an adult. Children didn't get coffee rations. It seems like a small thing, maybe, compared to everything else that was happening. But coffee mattered. People would stretch it by mixing it with chicory, or they'd reuse the grounds, brewing them 2 or 3 times, until the coffee was so weak it was barely brown. Some people gave up coffee entirely, saved their ration stamps for other things. My grandmother said her father never complained about anything except the coffee. He worked long hours at the steel mill, and he loved his coffee, strong and black before his shift. But during the war, the coffee got weaker and weaker until it was basically brown water, and he'd sit at the table in the morning, holding his cup, looking at it with his disappointed expression. And then one morning my grandmother said, he just started laughing. He laughed so hard he had to put the cup down, and her mother said, what's so funny? And he said, I'm sitting here feeling sorry for myself about bad coffee while men are dying in the Pacific. I'm ridiculous. And they both laughed, and he drank his terrible coffee, and he went to work. I think about that story a lot. Not because it's funny, though it kind of is, but because it shows how the war asked people to hold 2 feelings at the same time. Grief and gratitude, fear and hope. The knowledge that things were terrible, and the determination to keep going anyway. You can be sad about your coffee, and still know that your coffee doesn't really matter. Both things are true. Here's a hard thing to think about, but I want to mention it because it's important. Some soldiers were never found. They're still listed as missing in action. Their planes went down over the ocean. Or they were lost in the jungle, or they were buried in unmarked graves, or they simply disappeared in the chaos of battle. For their families, the war never really ended. There was no funeral, no body, no grave to visit. just uncertainty that stretched on for years, for decades. Some families never gave up hope that their son or husband or father would come home someday. They'd hear a knock at the door and think, maybe it's him. The military still looks for mere soldiers, did you know that? There's a whole division, the Defense POW, mere accounting agency, and they search crash sites, interview witnesses, use DNA testing. Every year they identify a few more remains and bring them home. Just last year they identified the remains of a pilot who'd been missing since 1944. He was finally buried in his hometown in Minnesota, with full military honors. His nephew was there. His nephew was 70 years old. Can you imagine? 70 years of not knowing, and then finally, an answer. Finally, closure, or something like it. But there are still more than 2,000 Americans from World War II who are still unaccounted for. Still missing. They're out there somewhere. In the ocean, in the jungle, in the earth. And their families, most of them gone now too, they spent their whole lives wondering. It's very dark outside right now. It's after midnight, and the snow is still falling, and there's no moon tonight, just darkness and snow. During the war, in the cities, the darkness was different. The blackout curtains, remember. No streetlights, no lit windows, no neon signs. Cities that had been bright at night, London, Berlin, Tokyo, New York, went dark. People had to learn to navigate by feel, by memory. They'd walk home from work in complete darkness, hands out in front of them, counting steps, listening for landmarks. Traffic accidents increased. People walked into things, fell down stairs. It was dangerous, but it was necessary. And you know what? People said the stars were incredible. In London, during the Blitz, between the bombing raids, people would look up and see the Milky Way for the first time in their lives. The city had always been too bright before, but now, in the forced darkness, the universe revealed itself. There's something to that, I think. Sometimes you have to remove the light to see the stars. Sometimes things have to get dark before you notice what's been there all along. I'm not saying the war was good. It wasn't. It was terrible. But I am saying that people found moments of beauty anyway. They couldn't help it. I mentioned my grandfather's letters at the beginning. I've been reading through them, slowly, a few at a time. There are maybe 200 of them, tied up in bundles with string. Letters he sent home during the war, and letters he received. They're remarkable in how unremarkable they are. Most of them are just about daily life. Dear Mom and Pop, they start, I'm doing fine. Weather's been cold, but we're managing. They had shepherd's pie for dinner tonight, which wasn't too bad. That sort of thing. There's not much about the war itself. Partly that's because of censorship. His letters would have been read by an officer before being sent, and anything sensitive would have been cut out. But partly, I think, it's because he didn't want to worry them. He wanted to give them the version of himself that was okay. That was coping. In one letter, he talks about learning to play cards, poker specifically. He says, some of the fellows are teaching me. I'm not very good yet, but it passes the time. In another letter, he mentions a cat that lived on the base, a grey tabby that the men fed scraps to. He says, we call her Churchill because she's fat and grumpy and determined. These tiny details, these moments. And then there are the letters he received. His mother wrote to him every week without fail, long letters about life at home, the weather, the neighbor's new baby, what they had for Sunday dinner, the score of the Brewers' game. Nothing important, but everything important. In one letter, from October 1944, she tells him about canning tomatoes. That's the whole letter, basically. How she and his aunt canned 42 jars of tomatoes from the garden. She describes the process, the smell of the tomatoes cooking, how her hands were red from the hot jars, and at the end she writes, I made sure to can extra, so there will be plenty when you come home. When you come home. Not if. When, that's hope. That's what kept people going. Let me tell you about how long 6 years is. If you're 18 when the war starts, you're 24 when it ends. You've gone from being a teenager to being an adult, but you've done it in foxholes and bombers and submarines. You've missed 6 Christmases, 6 birthdays, 6 springs. If you had a girlfriend when you left, she might be married to someone else now. Your little sister, who was 12, is 18 now. Your parents have gotten older. The family dog has died. 6 years is 2,191 days. That's 2,191 mornings of waking up and wondering if you'll make it to bedtime. 2,191 nights of trying to sleep in unfamiliar places. Scared, tired, far from home. But here's another way to think about it. 2,191 days is also 2,191 opportunities for small kindnesses. For a letter from home, for a moment of laughter with your buddies, for a sunset that catches you off guard with its beauty, for a memory of someone you love. Even in war, the days accumulate. Moments stack up. People find ways to be human. I read about a group of soldiers who were pinned down in a building in France for 3 days during the fighting in 1944. They couldn't leave because of sniper fire, and they were running out of food and water. And in the building, they found a piano. An old upright piano, miraculously undamaged despite the fighting all around. And one of the soldiers, a kid from Texas, he sat down and played. He knew how to play because his mother had insisted he take lessons when he was young, even though he'd complained about it. And now here he was, in the middle of a war, playing this piano in this half-destroyed building. He played for hours, hymns mostly and songs from home, and his fellow soldiers sat there in the darkness, listening, not talking, just listening. That's humanity. That's what we are. Even here, even now, there's music. I want to tell you something interesting. World War II exists in black and white in our collective memory, because that's how the photographs and film footage are. When we think of the war, we think in black and white, grayscale, but of course it wasn't. The war happened in color, full, living color. The sky was blue, the grass was green, blood was red. The ocean was grey-green and churning. Flowers still bloomed. There's something strange about that, isn't there? How our medium for preserving memory affects how we remember. My grandfather's uniform was olive drab. That's a green-brown color, sort of muddy, practical. His eyes were blue. The B-17 seconds he worked on were silver aluminum, with Army Air Force stars painted on the sides. The inside of the bombers was green. The flak jackets were dark green canvas. When he came home, he wore his uniform to surprise his family. He took a train from New York to Milwaukee, and then a bus to his neighborhood, and he walked up the street in his uniform carrying his duffel bag. It was April, he told me. Early April 1945. The lilacs were starting to bloom. Purple. He said he'd never seen anything more beautiful than those purple lilacs on his street, because it meant he was home. Color matters. Color is life. You might be getting tired now, and that's okay. That's actually the point. I'm hoping you're comfortable, maybe getting close to sleep. Your breathing is probably slowed down. Maybe your eyes are closed or nearly closed. That's good. The soldiers were tired too. Not just physically tired, though they were that. Exhausted beyond what we can probably imagine, but tired in their souls, tired of being afraid, tired of seeing terrible things, tired of being away from home. There's a thing called war weariness, where you're so tired that you almost stop caring about danger. You just want to rest. You'd almost rather something happen than continue to wait for something to happen. That's a dangerous kind of tired. But here's what I want you to know. They endured. Somehow, impossibly, they endured. Day after day, month after month, year after year. They got up, and they kept going. Because what else could they do? And eventually, the war ended. Eventually, there was peace, and they got to rest. You get to rest now, too. You get to lie here in your warm bed, in your safe home, in this time of peace, and you get to let your mind drift. You don't have to stay alert. You don't have to be afraid. You can just let go. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945. 5E Day. Victory in Europe. When the news came through, people poured into the streets. Spontaneous celebrations everywhere. In Times Square, in Piccadilly Circus, in every town and city and village. People were crying and hugging strangers and kissing and laughing. Church bells rang. People banged pots and pans. Car horns honked for hours. But it wasn't completely joyful, you know. The war in the Pacific was still going on, and everyone had lost someone, or knew someone who had lost someone. The celebrations were mixed with grief. My grandmother said that when 5E Day was announced, she was at work at the parachute factory. The supervisor stopped the production line and told everyone the news. And the women cheered, and they cried, and they hugged each other. But then they went back to work, because the parachutes were still needed in the Pacific. The war wasn't over, not yet. 3 months later, in August, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's a whole other heavy topic. One that people still argue about. One that I don't think I can adequately address right now, at this hour, in this context. But it happened. And it ended the war. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. 5J Day. Victory over Japan. And then it was truly over. The most terrible war in human history was over. Imagine the sound of a train arriving. The hiss of the brakes. The screech of metal on metal, the conductor calling out the station name, the doors opening, people stepping off, looking around, shielding their eyes from the sun. That was the sound of soldiers coming home. They came back in waves, over months. First the wounded, then the soldiers who had been there the longest, then everyone else. The trains and ships were full of men in uniform, returning to a world that had changed in their absence. Some of them were greeted by huge crowds, by bands and banners and celebrations. Some of them arrived quietly, at small stations in the middle of the night, and walked home through empty streets. My grandfather arrived at Mitchell Field in Milwaukee on a rainy day in September 1945. His mother and father were there, and his younger sister. He said when he saw them, he felt like he couldn't move. He just stood there with his duffel bag looking at them until his mother ran up and grabbed him. He said she felt so small. He didn't remember her being so small. They took him home, and his mother had made dinner. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, pie. His favorite. They ate together in the kitchen, and everyone talked too much and laughed too hard, the way you do when you're trying not to cry. And then, after dinner, he went upstairs to his room. His old room. It was exactly as he'd left it 3 years before. Same bedspread, same books on the shelf, same baseball mitt in the corner. He sat on the bed, the same bed he'd slept in as a child, as a teenager. And he just sat there for a while. He was home. He was actually home, and he cried. Here's something important. Most of the soldiers didn't talk about the war when they came home. Not right away. Sometimes not ever. My grandfather would tell stories occasionally. Funny stories mostly, about the cat named Churchill, or learning to play poker, or the time someone accidentally put salt in the coffee instead of sugar. Safe stories. Stories that didn't hurt, but he didn't talk about the hard things. The planes that didn't come back, the friends he'd lost, the fear, whatever else he saw or felt during those years. My grandmother said that sometimes, late at night, she'd hear him get up and sit in the kitchen in the dark, just sitting there. She'd ask if he was okay, and he'd say yes. He just couldn't sleep. And she'd sit with him for a while, not saying anything, just being there. A lot of families had similar experiences. The soldier would come home, and he'd be there physically, but part of him was still somewhere else, still in the war. We call it PTSD now, post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then they called it shell shock or battle fatigue, or they didn't call it anything at all. They just said, he's not quite himself, or he has bad dreams sometimes. And the families learned to be patient, to give them space, to not ask too many questions, because what could you say, really? How could you describe something that there weren't words for? You couldn't, so you didn't. You just kept living. You got up, you went to work, you made dinner, you mowed the lawn, you went to church on Sunday. You rebuilt your life around the hole the war had left, the same way you'd work around a rock when you're planting a garden. After the war, there were a lot of babies. A lot of babies. That's why they call it the baby boom. Think about it. Millions of young men had been away for years, and now they were home, and they were alive, and they wanted to build lives. They wanted normalcy. They wanted families. They wanted to create something instead of destroy something. So they got married. Many of them to girlfriends they'd been writing to during the war, or sweethearts they'd known before. And they had babies. Lots of babies. Between 1946 and 1964, about 76 million babies were born in the United States. That's a lot of hope when you think about it. That's a whole generation of people saying, yes, despite everything, despite what we've seen and what we've been through, we believe in the future. We believe things can be good again. My father was born in 1947. He's a baby boomer, though he doesn't like that term much. He says it makes it sound like they all exploded at once, which I suppose they kind of did. My grandfather told me once that when my father was born, he held him in the hospital and just cried. Happy tears, but also tears for all the men he'd known who would never get to hold their sons, who would never get to have this moment. Survival guilt, maybe. Or just the overwhelming sense of, I made it, I'm here, this is real. My father's middle name is Frank. After Frank Holden, the boy from Marquette who died in Normandy. My grandfather didn't know Frank personally. Frank was younger from a different neighborhood. But my grandfather wanted to remember, wanted to carry that name forward into the future. So Frank lives on in a way. In my father's middle name, which became my middle name too, Frank Michael. I'm Joseph Frank Michael. That's how we survive death, I think. We carry each other forward. The war changed everything. I mean everything. Before the war, America was still recovering from the Great Depression. A lot of people were poor, struggling. There wasn't much industry. But the war effort required massive production. Ships, planes, tanks, weapons, supplies. And all that production created jobs, developed new technologies, built new infrastructure. After the war, America was suddenly the most powerful country in the world. The manufacturing capacity, the economic strength, the military reach, it all came from the war, and that shaped everything that came after. The suburbs, the highways, the prosperity of the 1950s and 60s, the Cold War, the space race, all of it traces back to World War II. The world was literally rebuilt. Europe was in ruins, Japan was in ruins, and they had to be put back together. The Marshall Plan sent billions of dollars to help rebuild Europe. General MacArthur oversaw the rebuilding of Japan. ND people who had been enemies became allies. Germany, Japan, Italy. All of them became democratic nations, trading partners, friends. That's remarkable when you think about it. That's hope too, in its way. The belief that people can change, that nations can change. Not saying everything turned out perfect. It didn't. There was the Cold War, and Korea, and Vietnam, and a whole lot of other problems. The 20th century was complicated, but the fact that Germany and France are now allies, that Germany and Poland are now allies, that Japan and America are now allies, that would have seemed impossible in 1945. Absolutely impossible, and yet here we are. My grandfather kept a photograph in his wallet for his entire adult life. It's a small photograph, black and white, bent at the corners from being carried so long. It shows 7 young men in Army Air Force uniforms, standing in front of a B-17 bomber. They're smiling, squinting into the sun, arms around each other's shoulders. My grandfather is second from the left. He's 21 years old in that photograph. He looks so young. They all do. On the back of the photograph, written in faded pencil, are 7 names, and next to each name a date. The dates are all different, spread out over 1944 and 1945. Those are the dates they died. All of them, except my grandfather. He's the only one who made it home. I found this photograph in his wallet after he died in 1998. I was helping my grandmother go through his things, and there it was, tucked behind his driver's license. He'd carried it for more than 50 years. I asked my grandmother if she'd known about it, and she said yes. She'd seen it once or twice over the years, but he'd never talked about it. Never explained who the men were or what had happened to them. He remembered them every day, she said. That was his way of remembering. I have the photograph now. I don't carry it in my wallet. It's too fragile, too precious, but I keep it in a frame on my bookshelf. Those 7 young men, frozen in time, smiling in the sun. Sometimes I look at it and think, what would they have become? What lives would they have lived? What children would they have had? What grandchildren? What jokes would they have told? What songs would they have loved? All that potential just gone, but not forgotten. My grandfather made sure of that. Peace has a rhythm, did you know that? It's different from the rhythm of war. In war, everything is urgent, sudden, loud. You're always waiting for something terrible to happen. Your body is tense, ready to move, ready to react. Time stretches out and contracts. Moments of terror that feel like hours, hours of boredom that feel like minutes. In peace, time moves differently, more gently. There's a predictability to it. Morning comes, then afternoon, then evening. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Spring, summer, fall, winter. The same things happen at the same times, and that repetition is comforting. When soldiers came home, they had to learn that rhythm again. Or maybe learn it for the first time if they'd enlisted young. Wake up at a reasonable hour. Have breakfast, go to work, come home, have dinner, maybe read the paper, listen to the radio, go to bed. Do it all again tomorrow. Boring in the best possible way. My grandfather got a job at a tool and die company in Milwaukee. He worked there for 37 years, until he retired. Same job, same company, same drive to work every morning. He told me once. I was maybe 14, and I was complaining about something being boring. I don't remember what. He said, "Joey, boring is a gift." I learned that during the war. Boring means no one's trying to kill you. Boring means you get to see tomorrow. That changed how I thought about things. Even now, when I'm doing something routine, grading papers, grocery shopping, folding laundry, I sometimes think, this is the gift. This quiet, ordinary moment. This is what they fought for. Not everything was lost in the war. Some things survived. Books survived. Art survived. Music survived. Buildings survived, at least some of them. Families survived. Love survived. There's a museum in Amsterdam, the Rijksmuseum, and during the war they hid the paintings. They took Rembrandt's Night Watch and rolled it up and hid it in a bunker. They hid Vermeer's paintings, hid all the masterpieces, buried them, or walled them up, or moved them to secret locations. The museum itself was damaged in the war. But when peace came, they brought the paintings back, unrolled them, cleaned them, hung them back on the walls, and people came to see them. People who had survived the war, who had lost so much, they came to the museum and stood in front of these paintings and cried. Because here was beauty that had survived. Here was proof that not everything had been destroyed. That's what art is for, I think. It's a way of saying this matters, this is worth saving, this is worth carrying into the future. Music, too. During the war, people still made music. They played in nightclubs, in bomb shelters, in military camps. They wrote songs about missing someone, about coming home, about keeping your spirits up. We'll meet again, I'll be seeing you. Don't sit under the apple tree. My grandparents' song was, I'll be seeing you. They heard it on the radio before my grandfather shipped out, and it became their song. She'd play it on the phonograph while he was gone, and think of him. And when he came home, they danced to it in the kitchen. I have a recording of it, not the original, but a later version. Sometimes I play it late at night when I can't sleep, and I think about my grandparents, young and in love, separated by a war, holding on to hope through a song. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places. That's a promise. That's faith in the future. Most towns have a war memorial. Marquette has one in the town square, near the bandshell. It's a granite obelisk, with bronze plaques, listing the names of local men who died in various wars. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. The World War II section has 63 names. 3 people from this one small town. Gone. Every Memorial Day, there's a ceremony at the monument. The VFW does it. Veterans of foreign wars. There aren't many World War II veterans left now. When I was a kid, there were maybe 20 or 30 of them at the ceremony. Old men in their uniforms with medals on their chests. Now there are 4. Just 4. Mr. Patterson, who's 98. Mr. De Vries, who's 96. Mrs. Chen, who's 94. She was a nurse. And Mr. Kowalski, who's 99 and uses a wheelchair but insists on coming every year. Hey, stand there. Or sit, in Mr. Kowalski's case, and they salute while someone reads the names. All 63 names. And then there's a moment of silence, and someone plays taps on a trumpet. Go every year. I'm not a veteran, I've never served, but I go to pay my respects, to remember. Last year, after the ceremony, I talked to Mr. Patterson for a while. He was in the Pacific, fought in the Philippines. He's a small man, gentle, soft-spoken. You'd never guess what he'd been through unless he told you. I asked him, and maybe this was too personal, but he didn't seem to mind. I asked him what he thought about when he heard those 63 names read aloud. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the monument. Then he said, I think about how lucky I am, and I think about how random it all was. Why them and not me? There's no good answer to that. So I just try to live in a way that honors them, that makes their sacrifice mean something. Then he smiled and said, Plus, I think about how I need to get home because my wife's making pot roast, and I don't want to miss it. That's the thing about survivors. They carry the weight of the lost, but they also carry the joy of being alive. Both at once. The war cast a long shadow. It still does. Every person who lived through it was shaped by it, and they shaped their children, who shaped their children. Trauma and resilience both passed down through generations. My father, born just after the war, grew up in a house where certain things weren't talked about, where his father sometimes had nightmares, where his mother saved everything: rubber bands, aluminum foil, jars, string, because she remembered rationing, where nothing was wasted, ever. That shaped my father, made him careful, thrifty, appreciative of stability. And that shaped me. I grew up hearing stories about the Depression and the war, even though they happened decades before I was born. I grew up understanding that peace is precious, that democracy is fragile, that freedom isn't free, as the saying goes. I think every American my age and older carries some echo of World War II in them, whether they know it or not. It's in our national consciousness, in the way we think about heroism, sacrifice, patriotism, in the way we view America's role in the world, for better and worse. Because the war also taught us that we could solve problems with military force, that we were powerful enough to reshape the world. And that's led to, well, a lot of complicated situations since then. I'm not a political person, really. I teach choir to middle schoolers, but I do think about these things sometimes. How history isn't really in the past. It's still with us, still shaping us. The war ended 80 years ago now, well, almost 81, but its effects ripple forward still. We'll probably keep rippling for as long as there are people who remember it, or who remember people who remembered it. That's how memory works. It's handed down, like a family recipe, or a photograph, or a story told at dinner, and as long as we keep handing it down, the people who fought and died aren't really gone. They're still here, in a way, in our memories, in our values, in the choices we make about how to live. Hold on. Did you hear that? That's just the house settling. Or maybe the wind. It's still snowing out there, very light now, almost done. The world is very quiet. When my grandfather couldn't sleep, in those late-night hours when the memories were too strong, he'd sometimes go out to the garage. He had a workshop out there, and he'd work on little projects. Birdhouses, mostly. He must have made 100 birdhouses over the years. My grandmother would find them in the morning, lined up on the workbench. Evidence of his insomnia, but he didn't throw them away or anything. He'd give them to neighbors, to the school, to the church. He'd put them up in his own backyard. Our yard always had 6 or 7 birdhouses, all different designs. I asked him once, why birdhouses? Why not something else? He thought about it for a while, the way he did when you asked him a real question. Then he said, I like the idea of making something that helps something else survive. That's all. That's all. Making something that helps something else survive. I think that's maybe the lesson of the whole war, if there is one. That's what we're supposed to do. Help each other survive. Build shelter for each other, literal or otherwise. Create safe places. My grandfather's been gone for 26 years now, but his birdhouses are still out there, some of them, still standing in various yards around Milwaukee, still housing birds. That's immortality, in a small way. Making something useful that outlasts you. Here's a strange thing to consider. If any one of those soldiers who died in the war had survived, the whole world would be different. Not in huge ways necessarily, but in small ways that add up. If Frank Holden had come home from Normandy, he might have gotten married, had children. Those children would have had children, and now, 80 years later, there might be 50 or 100 people walking around who only exist because Frank survived, but he didn't survive. So those people don't exist. Those potential futures were erased. Now multiply that by 70 million, all the people who died in the war, all those missing futures, all those children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who never were. It's impossible to comprehend, really, the sheer scale of the absence. But here's the flip side. Everyone who is alive today exists because of a million random chances, Because someone survived a battle they could have died in. Because someone caught a different train. Because someone turned left instead of right at exactly the right moment. My grandfather survived because he was ground crew, not a pilot. If he'd had better eyesight, his vision was slightly poor, not enough to keep him out of the service entirely, but enough to disqualify him from flight training. He might have been a pilot. And if he'd been a pilot, statistically, he probably would have died. The casualty rate for bomber crews was around 40%. So I exist because my grandfather's eyesight was slightly bad. That's the chain of events. That's the thread I'm hanging from. We're all hanging from threads like that. Impossibly thin, impossibly fragile threads of chance and circumstance. And maybe that should make us more appreciative of each other, more kind. Because we're all miracles in a way. We're all the result of 1,000 near misses and lucky breaks and random chances that went the right way. Every person you pass on the street, every person you talk to, every person who exists, they're all unlikely survivors. We all are. My grandmother made the best apple pie I've ever had. She made it the old-fashioned way, with lard in the crust and cinnamon and nutmeg, and she'd cut these beautiful vents in the top crust in the shape of leaves. She'd make it in the fall, when the apples were fresh. She'd send my grandfather to the orchard to get apples, and he'd come back with a bushel, and she'd make pies. She'd make 4 or 5 at a time and freeze them, and then we'd have apple pie all winter. The smell of that pie baking, that's what peace smells like to me. Cinnamon and butter and apples, and the warm smell of the oven, and the way the whole house would fill up with that smell. After the war, my grandmother kept making that pie. Every fall, for 50-something years, until she got too old to stand at the counter for that long. And every time she made it, she'd say the same thing. Your grandfather missed this pie so much during the war. Now he can have it whenever he wants. That was her gift to him. Apple pie, the promise that life would be sweet again, that there would be pie whenever he wanted it. It's a small thing. But small things matter. We're forgetting World War II. Not intentionally, but we are. It's slipping away from living memory into history. The last veterans are dying. A few hundred American World War II veterans die every day now. Soon, maybe in 5 years, maybe 10, there won't be any left. No one alive who fought in it. No one who can say, I was there. This is what it was like. And then it will exist only in books and photographs and films and museums. Important, yes. Preserved, yes. But not alive in the same way. My students learn about World War II in history class. But it's ancient history to them. As far from their lives as the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. They can't really grasp it. How could they? They've never known anything but peace. At least here at home. That's good, I suppose. That's what we'd want. We want children to grow up without war. But something is lost when memory fades. Some kind of urgency. Some kind of understanding that freedom and peace aren't guaranteed. That they have to be defended, protected, renewed in each generation. I don't know how to fix that. Maybe you can't. Maybe forgetting is inevitable, necessary even. Maybe you can't move forward if you're always looking back. But I do think we have a responsibility to remember. Not to glorify war. War is terrible, always. But to remember what was lost. To honor the sacrifice. To learn the lessons if we can. That's why I'm talking to you about this tonight. Because in some small way, I'm passing it on. The memory. The story. And maybe you'll remember some of it. And maybe you'll tell someone else someday. And that's how it continues. It's very quiet now. The snow has stopped. The world outside is white and still. This is the kind of quiet my grandfather must have dreamed about during the war. No engines, no sirens, no gunfire. Just silence. Deep, clean silence. In a book I read about the war, I can't remember which one, I've read so many, a soldier said that the thing he missed most about home wasn't people or places or things. It was silence. The ability to hear nothing. To have a moment of peace inside his own head. The war was loud. Constantly loud. Even when there wasn't active fighting. There were engines, trucks, radios, men talking and shouting, planes overhead, generators, everything making noise all the time. So silence became precious, rare, something to long for. When the soldier finally got home, he said, he spent a whole afternoon just sitting in his backyard, listening to nothing, the absence of sound, and it made him cry. I think about that sometimes when things get too noisy, when there's too much going on, too many demands, too much stimulus. I step outside, or I sit in a quiet room, and I just listen to the silence. And I'm grateful for it. Grateful that I have the luxury of silence, that I'm safe enough to appreciate it. That's a gift from everyone who fought in that war, and all the wars. They fought so we could have silence, so we could have peace, so we could sit in our homes on a snowy night and not be afraid. I need to tell you about one more letter. It's the last letter in my grandfather's collection. It's from August 1945, after the war ended but before he came home. He was still in England, waiting for transport back to the States. The letter is addressed to his mother, same as all the others. But this one is different. It says, "Dear Mom, I can't quite believe I'm writing this, but it's true. The war is over, really, truly over. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's a mistake, but it's not. We won. It's finished. I'll be home soon. Maybe a month, maybe 2. I don't know exactly when, but soon. I've been thinking about what I want to do when I get there. And you know what? I don't want anything fancy. I don't need a big welcome, or a party, or anything like that. I just want to sit in the kitchen and have a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the terrible stuff we have here, and maybe a piece of your apple pie. And I want to sleep in my own bed. And I want to wake up in the morning and know that I don't have to go anywhere or do anything I don't want to do. That's all. That's all I want. I love you. Tell Pop and Susan I love them too. I'll see you soon. Love, Walter." That's the whole letter. Very short. Very simple. And that's what he did, my grandmother told me. He came home, and he had coffee and pie, and he slept for almost 2 days straight. And then he got up, and he started his life. No parades, no fanfare, just life. Simple, ordinary, beautiful life. That's what they were fighting for. Not glory or conquest or power. Just the right to live a simple, ordinary life. To come home. To have coffee and pie. To sleep safely in your own bed. And when you think about it that way, it makes perfect sense. That's what we all want, isn't it? Safety. Home. The people we love. Simple pleasures. Nothing fancy. That's everything. It's almost morning now. Not quite, but almost. That deep blue-black time before sunrise, when the world is as quiet as it's going to get. You're probably asleep by now, or very close to it. And that's good. That's what I hoped for. I hope you've had good dreams, or at least peaceful ones. I hope you've rested well. When you wake up, whenever that is, there's no hurry. The world will still be here. The same world, more or less. Your bed, your room, your life, the ordinary world, the peaceful world. And maybe, when you wake up, you'll remember some of what I've told you. Maybe you'll think about the people who fought in World War II, the people who survived, and the people who didn't. Maybe you'll remember that the simple, ordinary things, the things we take for granted, aren't guaranteed. that people fought and died for them. Or maybe you won't remember any of this. Maybe it will have faded into your dreams, mixed in with everything else. And that's okay too. The important thing is that you're here, that you're alive, that you have the gift of another day. That's what they gave us. Days, peaceful, ordinary days. So when you wake up, maybe take a moment to appreciate it. The sunlight coming through your window, the smell of coffee, if you drink coffee, the sound of birds, if there are birds in your neighborhood, the feeling of being warm and safe and home. That's everything. That's the whole point. I'm going to let you sleep now. I'm going to stop talking and let the silence come back in. Outside, the snow has covered everything. The street, the sidewalk, the yard. Everything is white and clean and new. The sun will come up in a few hours and melt some of it, and then life will continue. Cars will drive by. People will walk their dogs. The mail will come. The ordinary rhythms of peace. My grandfather used to say that every morning is a gift. Every morning you wake up and you're still here. That's a gift. Not everyone gets that. So you should be grateful. You should pay attention. You should try to make the day matter, even if it's just in small ways. That's what I'm trying to do. Pay attention. Make things matter. And that's what I hope for you too. So sleep well. Rest. Let yourself drift off. And when you wake up, remember that you're lucky. Remember that you're safe. Remember that peace is precious. And if you can, if you get the chance, make something today that helps something else survive. That's all. That's everything. Good night. Thank you for listening. The world is quiet now. Sleep well.